Very good discussion this week for Critical Perspectives. And I know it's hard to have these conversations. No one wants to offend or upset anybody. And we're all aware, to some degree, about the existence of privilege. But we're not all familiar with the language and the terms to express it. And so what I'm going to do in this video is talk a little bit about how I came to think about some of these ideas, because I think that in many ways this journey of becoming more of a culturally responsive teacher in the online context, or it is the same regardless of the context. I think in many ways it's a personal kind of development that one has to go through, as opposed to just a sort of the apprehension of a set of theories. The theories are very helpful to give us language and ways to understand it, but we honestly have to, I think, really think about this in relation to ourselves. And I think also that, and in fact, this has helped me hugely talking about this with you this week. This is the most explicit I've ever really got into these discussions, I think, in these online courses, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. So I do think my current thinking on this, and it does change all the time, but it does seem to be going in a particular direction, is that I think issues of culture have to enter explicitly into our online designs of pedagogy. Certainly our awareness, because I have actually said in a couple of notes in these questions 2 and 3, I think I talked about how I wish I'd done this more explicitly in this class, but I have a better way of thinking about it for the next class. So I do acknowledge the diversity of people coming into this course, but I tend to talk about it in terms of cognitive things and possibly affect, how you're feeling. Are you feeling anxious about because you haven't taken online courses before, or you don't have a background in some of the conceptual material that we're going to be talking about, and those kinds of things. And that's I think that if I didn't just have the cognitive emphasis, but I also made a space to where there's an explicit reference to culture. And I think that is because I realize that trust, what I'm trying to create here, and we've talked about it a lot in different ways, is trying to create a sense of trust and enough comfort that people are able to speak from wherever they are speaking from in a way that they don't have to feel ignored or left out or criticized or judged. And it's very hard, because it's really hard not to judge people. We judge people in face-to-face contexts all the time. So there is some sort of thought that if in the online context, because these things are not front and center, that maybe we can not do the judging. And yet we do judge, because people have names, and even if we don't use avatars, which was a very interesting conversation this week, and I had lots of ideas from that. I'm going to look at Bitstrips a bit more. I think I kind of like that. Even if we don't have a whole strip, we could have a sort of an intro activity that where people talked about the idea of creating their avatars and what principles they were using. I think that just as an awareness activity might be very good, and I think there were a couple of mentions of this in your notes this week, which I found very helpful. And I think we all feel vulnerable. We feel vulnerable cognitively. I know somebody mentioned imposters. All students feel like imposters as graduate students, I think, and frankly as faculty, I feel less like an imposter these days, but I still do from time to time. I think we have doubts about ourselves, and we're more fragile, I think, sometimes than we like to let on. So I think that's why the building of trust is such a sort of tricky thing, and I think that what I haven't really fully dealt with is that our experience of vulnerability is framed uniquely through our own culturally situated educational and personal lives. And I kind of knew that intellectually, but I haven't been, I think, walking the walk really with it. And so that's something I think I would definitely try to do more next time I do this course and the other one I do. And I'm just going to talk a bit about whiteness and me for a minute, not because I just out of my own ego, but just because I want to use it as an example of how people experience difference in different sorts of ways. And so, like, I'm obviously a white, and I was a middle class, grew up in this middle class family in England, and I went to private school, and so I had a very particular experience of privilege. However, I was also adopted, and I knew I was adopted from when I was very young. And in those days, everybody thought that everything was genetic. So class, by I realized my parents, by some of the things that they said, was considered to be something that you know, people were born to, and you were bred in a certain way. And there was that notion of breeding, which was genetic and blood related. So because I was adopted, I wasn't a part of that group. And also because I was adopted, and my parents were Catholic, and as was my birth mother, I also knew, without anybody really talking about this, that I was from a working class family, because otherwise my mother would not have, she would have had enough money perhaps to keep me. And so I had a very strong sense of difference at that point, and I felt I was passing a lot of the time as this middle class kid, because I sounded like a middle class kid, and and I was a nice little girl with curly hair, and but I felt out somewhat outside that, and I did feel I was passing, and I felt like I was not really entirely, that was not really my identity, the full description of my identity. And I think that had, when I also had problems at school. I was very good at sports and stuff, but I didn't thrive in an academic environment, and yet I'd learned to read before I was 4, so it wasn't that I couldn't do it. It was just not a good environment for me. So I ended up leaving and feeling that I had intellectual challenges, and it took me years to realize that no, actually I'm quite smart, and be comfortable with that. So I think that we all face, experiences of difference, but those experiences are very different, and yet they impact how we respond to other people. So it's always been very easy for me to respond very sympathetically to students who have issues around school and family and all of those kinds of things, because I understand that, and I see your education as part of your whole life. I don't see it as something you do just with me and it's just around work stuff. When I do the mentoring that I do in my job as associate chair for graduate studies, I mentor and counsel whole people. I am with my graduate students too. We talk about their families and their lives, and how they're going to do this work in the context of all of the lives that they live in. And that holistic perspective has always informed how my personal interactions with my students. But because I was a cognitive scientist by training, and so my work broadly fits in the learning sciences, and with a big sort of emphasis on psychology, I've always used these universalist kinds of paradigms, and which tend to not look at difference in that particular kind of way. If they look at difference, it's usually in a deficit model, so something like special needs, or in affective terms. I guess there are some sort of ways of looking at a difference in there, but not the kind of culturally based systemic sorts of categories that we've been talking about, that broadly fit with culture, gender, those kinds of things. So that wasn't a piece of my scholarship in the kind of upfront way that it is with some of the people in our critical curriculum studies and pedagogy group, for instance, in curriculum teaching and learning here. So I've started to realize that I need to move towards a more explicit sort of inclusion of difference, because in order for me to feel like I was being both coherent and intellectually honest in my ways of being with my students. And so I think that our challenge is really developing safe spaces for learning, guided by our students' feedback, and seeing the cultural dimension the way we already see in many ways in our students. As we see our students as unique combinations of people who join each course, who have a dynamic as a group, like you have a dynamic as a whole group, but you also have your individual differences, and we work together to find a constructive and productive and safe path for our collective learning. And that's what I see the value of having this cultural piece as an explicit part of how we do good online teaching. It's not that we have to stay there all the time, but we need to have a place where those experiences can be brought up and raised and are a valid part of the discussions we need to have about creating learning environments that are really effective for everybody. So that's my piece of my perspective on this at the moment. What I'll do is over the next few days I'm going to think more deeply about doing summaries. I'll do some summary notes for the different questions. But I wanted to put this piece out there just because I thought it might be informative, because I think sometimes these cultural conversations are harder for the people from the dominant group, right? And that's why I wanted to kind of, because they haven't had to do it before often, or if they have, they've done a little bit less of it, as I was trying to sort of explain in relation to my experience, and that's why I was using that as the sort of example. So, good stuff, and I will talk to you soon. And for next week, well, first of all, enjoy the March break and have a break. Next week, we're going to, when we start again, we're going to get into theoretical perspectives on online community, and I will be in touch with the moderators who I had in my mind and then I didn't write down and now I've forgotten. And it will be, who is it going to be? June and Alan. So you guys get in touch with me by sort of next weekend and we'll get the questions sorted out, and on we will go. But have a really good week. I hope the weather gets nice too. Okay, we'll talk to you soon.